So we're picking right back up where we left off from last time, where we're talking about memories and memory reconstruction and schemas. Now we're going to talk about how likely is it that you are going to be able to access this uh, particular schema. So we're going to talk about accessibility and priming. Now, accessibility is just the idea that it's the extent to which a particular schema or concept is at the forefront of your mind. How likely are you going to be able to use that, whether it's due to past experience or something that you recently dealt with? If you are going to if you more recently dealt with something, that's going to be more at the forefront of your mind, therefore increasing accessibility, versus something that you don't have a lot of experience with or you hadn't really thought about. That's going to be further in the back of your mind and less accessible to you. So the accessibility is important to think about because that can change how you think about certain things and make judgments based off of how accessible that schema is to you. And the other thing we're going to talk about is priming. So, priming is this process that actually influences accessibility. So, priming is when you have particular recent experiences that's actually going to increase the accessibility of a particular schema, trait, or concept. So, priming serves a function of actually increasing that accessibility, making it easier for you to think about that particular schema and use it in particular situations. Now, what are some other ways that can influence accessibility for schemas? So, um, the first one is that uh, that particular schema is chronically accessible because of past experience, something that you have direct experience with. Maybe you have a family member or a situation that you experienced even years ago that is just chronically there because it was such a big part of your life. And so that is going to make whatever schema is associated with that more accessible because of your past experience. The second reason could be that that particular schema is accessible because it's related to a particular current goal that you have. And I'm going to give you examples of each one of these as we move on to the next one. And the third one is that perhaps a particular schema is temporarily accessible because of a very recent experience that you might have had. So the example that I'm going to use is uh, for the next slide, is going to be an ambiguous situation, meaning that it can be interpreted a lot of different ways and you don't have all of the details. So, how are you going to interpret the situation? So, let's say you're on a bus and you see a man in the street and he is getting on the bus. Okay. And so you go, and the person is acting sort of belligerently. Okay. There's a lot of different ways that you can interpret that person's behavior and make judgments. And that interpretation will be based on the accessibility of certain schemas that you have. And that's going to determine how you then react and act in that particular situation. So let's say the first example is you are on the bus and you are in a situation where the person is acting sort of belligerently. Okay. Now, you can act in a way that you become sympathetic with that person. You can act in a way that is more like, oh, that person is sort of a negative connotation, like, oh man, that person's an alcoholic. I can't believe them. Why are they even here, et cetera, et cetera. So, what would determine, do you have more sympathy against with the person, or do you have less sympathy with the person, for example? So, let's say you are reading a book, okay, here about mental patients. You're reading a particular book and you're going, okay, it's a recently accessible idea that some people have mental illness and that people might be out in public acting a certain way. So because you were sort of primed to think in the direction of mental illness, if you're encountering this situation, okay, where the person is acting belligerently, okay, here you're reading a book about mental illness, this situation occurs, okay, you might come to the conclusion that the person's mentally ill. Okay. Maybe, so that would be an example of a recent experience that is immediately accessible to you. This idea of schemas about mentally ill people. And then the conclusion that you make is the person is mentally ill. And you go, oh, maybe I am sympathetic to that person because, um, I'm reading this book. Well, maybe let's take another route. Let's say that you have a family history of alcoholism, and let's say you have a family member who acts belligerently in a similar way. So maybe you take this route where you go, oh, that person looks like they're an alcoholic. Okay. And then maybe the solution, the same situation, same ambiguous situation. And then maybe the conclusion that you make is, wow, that person's hitting the bottle pretty early. Right. So because of you having that chronically uh, um, accessible past experience, it's going to change how you end up viewing that particular person. So maybe it's a goal, right? So we've talked about a recent experience. Okay, so this a recent experience means that a particular schema is temporarily accessible. That would be this case here. Okay, you're reading a book. Okay, maybe you have that chronically accessible schema because of past experience, would be the example here. Well, what about this one? What about this related to a current goal? Maybe you're in class and you want to work in a rehab facility for people who have alcoholism, or maybe they have drug addicts or whatever it might be, and you have a particular goal, and that is to better understand behavior. Well, that schema that you have will be even more accessible to you because you have that particular those thoughts in your mind, and you're interested in it, and it's a particular goal that you currently have. So accessibility is built around a lot of different things, and how you end up deciding to engage is going to be based on that. So maybe if you decide that you're not sympathetic to the person, maybe you ignore them. If you are sympathetic, maybe you want to reach out to them, and it changes maybe the course of how you act. So let's do I typically do an experiment in class. Instead of doing the experiment, we're gonna talk about how I do the experiment in class, because it's a little bit harder to do in an online class. So it's kind of a replication of a study that was done to look at, and we're going to go over the results of this particular study and what they actually found. It was done in by Barg in 1982, and so basically what happens is that you take two groups of people, and I typically split the class this way. And so before we actually begin with the official experiment, I give you time to memorize lists of words. So unbeknownst to the class, half of the group will get a list of very positive words like adventurous, self confident, independent, persistent, neat, respectful, fun, charming, etc., etc. And then the other half of the class gets more negative words like reckless, conceited, aloof, stubborn, cruel, greedy, selfish, impulsive, etc., etc. Okay. And so you get 30 seconds to read the list and then try to memorize what you can and then recall the words that you can from the list. And so after this experiment is done, now you're given a description about Donald. So everybody gets the same description about who Donald is. Okay. So basically it's sort of it can be ambiguously kind of determined what kind of person Donald is. So it's about like um, Donald climbs Mount McKinley. He's shot the Colorado Rapids in a kayak. He's driven in a demolition derby. He piloted a jet powered boat. He didn't know much about boats. He's risked injury and death. Now he's in search for new excitement, and he maybe wants to do some skydiving. And so, it's all about Donald doing really sort of adventurous things or potentially reckless things. And so, the description is once Donald made up his mind to do something, it was as good as done, no matter how long it might take or how difficult it might be. Only rarely did he change his mind, even when it might well have been better if he had. So you read this full description about Donald. And then you're given the task to describe Donald. So the idea is that you should write down some words to describe Donald. Okay. And then what kinds of words would you use to describe Donald, since Donald himself can be ambiguous? So, you can interpret this passage and his actions as more positive, as in he is more adventurous, more self-confident, or you can sort of interpret it more negatively in the sense that maybe he's really reckless and selfish and conceited. And so it turns out that depending on which words you were given at the beginning of the whole experiment, whether they were positive words or negative words, actually primes you to sway a particular way about how you describe Donald. So, for those people who previously were tasked to memorize the more positive words like adventurous, confident, independent, okay, and those people tended to form more positive impressions and used similar words to describe Donald. Whereas those people who were given the list of more negative words like reckless, conceited, aloof, and stubborn, they tended to form more negative impressions using words like reckless and stubborn, because they were primed in a more negative way to view this ambiguous thing as more negative than positive. And so you see priming happen all in throughout life. Okay. It really is very interesting how this actually applies in real life. But this priming is a really good example of how automatic thinking can influence how we interpret ambiguous situation. It's quick, it's unintentional, it's unconscious. These words, and you're not even thinking about the fact that you looked at all these positive words and now you're looking at this positive description. So it's a really interesting study that we see in the actual results. So in the people who were formed those positive impressions about Donald, those ones, this percentage, about 70%, actually formed positive impressions about Donald when they were primed with positive words. Only about 10% formed negative impressions when primed with the positive words. So an overwhelming majority of people were correctly primed to actually think about Donald in a particular way in which they were primed. So it's a really interesting idea to think about how when we when we do this, when we're primed for certain things, that we forget, uh, you know, or not really think about, and not even necessarily forget, but it's very unconscious in terms, or subconscious in terms of how we actually process information. So maybe you watched a special on alcoholism or a special on drug addiction, and the way that the documentary was done was a very positive way to talk about how we can, change the way that we approach addiction. And then you see somebody out, 3 days later, who looks like they might be addicted to a substance, and your reaction to that person might be different had you watched a documentary that was more negative. And we don't necessarily put these things together and say, oh, well, I'm looking at this person in a negative light because I watched a documentary about it, 3 weeks ago. So it's a really interesting way that we can sort of automatically be automatically primed to think about particular schemas. So, in this regard, we're going to move to sort of the next topic, and then I will do another video so that we can break it up just a little bit. But I want to get to the next idea before we move on to another video, and that is the persistence of schemas. And that's because when we're primed for particular information, and when we think about particular schemas and how accessible they are, what we find is that those schemas that we develop and really have sort of ingrained and rooted in our brains are very, very persistent in terms of they're hard to change completely. And so things that we might find is in sense of, like, for example, in a court system, if jurors are given particular instructions to ignore inadmissible evidence, for example, it's very difficult to just say, I'm going to forget that thing. You know it. and it's going to influence you, and it's going to prime you, and it's going to change the accessibility of particular schemas based off of your interpretation of whatever information that you're supposed to disregard. So those beliefs may persist. Even if evidence is discredited, those beliefs will still persist. And we're going to talk too later on about how this influences how we view about people. And so we're going to see this sort of theme throughout the class as well, that our ideas about what people are like tend to be very, very hard to change, and it takes a lot for us to rethink groups of people. And that's an important sort of part of this class, is to realizing that we do these things, and that we need to make sure that we know what we're doing, right? So in the case of priming and accessibility and persistence of schemas, another thing that we can do is actually influence how things happen. Okay. And so that would be what we refer to as, in some cases, the self-fulfilling prophecy. So self-fulfilling prophecy is when you have a particular expectation, for example, of what a person is like, what the person acts like. And that's expectation is going to change how we act toward that person. And that can actually change the person's behavior to act more consistently to our original expectations, making it self-fulfilling and actually turn out to be true. So, what's really interesting is that we see this happen. We can see this in the classroom. We can see this in real life. We can see this with friends. We can see this all throughout our lives, of how our expectations of people can actually change how they react to us because we expect them to act a certain way. And what usually happens is that we may not be as friendly to certain people because we might give off a certain vibe, right? So this is an example of a person. So here we have a person, you, okay, you're standing there, and you look at this person and you're like, ah, that person, what a snob. Okay. This person over here is probably not a snob. Person's like, I'm just living my life. Oh, what a nice day. Okay. And then what happens is that you then are going to change the way that you react to that person before that person's even had a chance to engage with you. You've got in your brain, this person's a snob. Okay, well, I'm going to ignore this person because I think they're a snob. Okay. And then what happens is that you behave towards the person in a way that's consistent with your expectation. And so that person's like, what happened? Right? They're lost. They don't understand. So then what happens is that as you snub them, okay, they're going to reflect the way that you act and behave in a similar manner. So they're going to snub you because you snub them. Wow, what a jerk, right? And that's what this person's saying. Oh, they're just going to ignore me. So then you're going to turn around and realize the person is acting in this sort of snub way. And then you're going to say, aha, I have confirmed my theory. You are, in fact, a snob. And then the cycle just continues. Okay. And you just assume that person's a jerk or a snob or whatever. And this happens all the time with people that we don't like. Okay. Or groups of people that we may feel not connected to. We go, oh, well, I don't think that person is a good person, or I don't like the way that they do things, or I think they're uneducated, or I think that they're not nice. And so you treat them in a way of the expectation of them not being educated or not nice. Maybe you talk down to them or you ignore them. Well, then a person is going to react to that, right? They're going to go, oh, well, I don't want to engage with you because you're talking down to me or you're ignoring me. And so that person's going to react. Whereas if this could have stopped this whole cycle right here. Yeah, you might think that person's a snob, but if you had said to that person, oh, hi, how are you? Maybe that person would have turned around and been like, oh, I'm good. How are you doing? And been like the nicest person ever. You could have stopped this cycle just by step one, treating them like a nice person. Now, sometimes people are jerks and sometimes people are snobs. And so sometimes you can treat somebody in a nice way, and for whatever reason, they are going to snub you anyway. That's a different story. This idea is that the person is fine and not what you expect. And then you treat them in a particular way, and they are going to then reflect that behavior to you. So One particular area that we can find this happen in the classroom is a series of studies that were done, ranging from they were done in 1983, 1986, 1994. Several studies have found the same sort of situation that can happen in the classroom. So, if you're interested in being a teacher, this is a really important thing that you really need to think about. So, this is classroom climate. Okay, so in this particular study, teachers were led to believe that a particular set of list of students, okay, were like their star students before they met them. Okay. These particular students were sort of ranked on a list, and the teacher was told, okay, these are the star performers. You can expect them to do really well in your class. They're really well behaved, et cetera, et cetera. So, what they did was this teachers actually treated those set of students differently than the other students on the list. Okay. So here are some ways that the teachers did treat them differently. So they created a warmer environment, emotional environment. They gave them more personal attention, gave them more encouragement and support. They gave those particular students more challenging material. They had higher expectations from them and expected them to do well. They gave them more feedback and better feedback. They were more engaged with them. They also gave those particular students more opportunities in class to respond. They gave them longer to respond, and they engaged with them more, generally speaking. So, what the teachers did not know was that list of bloomers, okay, quote unquote bloomers, right, was completely arbitrary. It was a random assortment of students. So what those teachers did, actually changed the path of those students, okay, and the outcome of their abilities, just by treating them as if they expected them to be smarter and better in the classroom. What they found is that um, the percentage of children who gained IQ points, 10 IQ points, okay? 80% of those students who were bloomers, okay, gained 10 full IQ points. Just under 50% of the students gained 20 IQ points. And just over 20% gained 30 IQ points. It's huge compared to the other students. So it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Essentially, what happened was the students who were the bloomers, right, that were expected to do better, did better because the teacher treated them differently. And so the teachers found out later that those set of students that were the bloomers were actually completely randomly selected. And so if you treat the students who are in your classroom, if you're a teacher, as everybody being a bloomer, then everyone will get better attention and be able to, do better. And we see this in not just in the classroom, but everywhere in life, right? If you treat people better, they react better to you. Now, however, sometimes people's true nature can actually win out. If a person is a jerk and they are, you have an expectation that they're going to be a jerk because you've heard from other friends they're a jerk and they just so happens to, that's just who they are. Okay. That's a limitation of self-fulfilling prophecy. You can be as nice as you can to them and they are going to just continue to be who they are. Right. Now, another thing on the flip side of this, you may expect a person to be a jerk, but maybe they're not. And you act negatively to them, right? And you snub them and they come out and they ignore it and they just are nice and they're not a jerk and they're just like very sweet to you. So the self-fulfilling prophecy did not work because they did not engage in the behavior that you expected them to engage in, and their true nature worked out and they're just a really sweet person. They're really nice. Think about times where you have been wrong about somebody. First impressions, right? You engage with somebody and you think you have an expectation that they're going to act a certain way, maybe a negative way. They completely are a wonderful person and you go, wow, I was really wrong about them. Okay. Doesn't happen super often, but it does happen. Also, we tend to see this happen when you're distracted. So in situations where you might experience a social situation and go, oh, there's a lot of people talking, or maybe there's loud music or something happens, we tend to go with these automatic processes, right? So an automatic process would be to just go with your schema and gut. And sometimes, they're going to occur when we're not paying attention very well. And so, it's hard for us to engage in controlled thinking when we are multitasking or distracted. And so we tend to um, not rely on controlled thinking in those situations. So I've got an activity on here because I'd like for you guys to test this out. I don't have this as an actual activity to get credit for because this is one of those things that you really need to be in person. And currently, it's difficult um, in this current situation to go out and engage with strangers. Especially with masks, it's really difficult to see people's facial expressions. And the whole purpose of this is to treat people with a big smile and be nice. And so I encourage you when you're ready and when it's relevant to go out and seek people out and to really not think about any preconceived notions that you might have. Just greet people with a smile. Act like they are the friendliest, sweetest person that you ever could imagine. And sort of mentally take note of how that person engages with you. And if you continue to do this throughout your life, what you'll find is that people tend to be very good at picking up on sincere, you're being sincere and you're being nice, and they tend to treat you in the same way. And so you can get a lot further in life by being a friendly person and just assuming that everybody is not a jerk. um, but anyway, so that's a good activity for you guys to do, working on throughout your life later on. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick up on the next concept in the next video. So I'm going to end this video here. If you have any questions, you can